I'm going to start off this video by showing you the space. Video, in a certain sense, is about space. It's about our heart space. And an idea of, perhaps, a new kind of morality. A morality that sort of embraces those systems of thinking that went before. But I'm going to use the metaphor of the Tao, or the Tao, as I believe in a certain way it was a foundation of showing how we can balance paradox mentally. However, the traditional Tao or Tao was static in that it didn't really allow for or really have an understanding of evolution. Problem with it, that was just the sort of cultural, sociological reality in which the historical creators or creator of the Tao kind of came from, so that they didn't have the scientific principles and conceptual frameworks from which one could design an integrative, adaptive Tao or Tao. So this is an attempt at doing that, in that I'm trying to include those earlier models, as I believe that in doing that you're actually really truly enhancing the system, in that we kind of carry all of those earlier models within us anyways. The more healthy mental models would therefore have a fairly complex embrace of earlier systems. So this is sort of a primitive drawing in that it's not very geometrically sound or beautiful. However, I think it could be drawn or mapped out with a computer to be much nicer. Things here metaphorically in some ways, like the heart at the center, or of these different toruses, as an expression of sort of the eye of the needle, or the transformation point, the center in which novelty arises. As our heart, in a certain way, is that. Our heart is sort of exact median point of our highest conceptualizations and our basest desires, so that when we fuse those two in our heart, the process arises of greater complexity, and so that complexity is an expression of the embrace of the old, so that you carry this boundary, this sheath, this first boundary into the. So now you have two-ness within that oneness. The first boundary, the boundary, is sort of an expression metaphorically of the, at least our idea of, say, the Big Bang. Now, whether or not that is the first boundary, whether or not there's actually not a boundary before that, is sort of beside the point. However, the idea here is that there's a split between the subject, the first subject, and the first object. But it's very primitive in that only one sheath, only one boundary around it. But as we go deeper, more and more boundaries are created. Notice that this carries with it sort of that Tao line. And that's the connection point. And then it splits and a new Tao line forms. And then that splits and a new, and that allows for these new boundaries to be generated. Not, again, an expression as it would maybe necessarily geometrically mapped in reality, but it's an expression of the metaphor of how that boundary arises. The first boundary doesn't have a we within it, but in a certain way it does, because it arises within that first, that there's two eyes. So those two eyes form, therefore, a we. And then those two its form an its. And then within that, we get higher and higher orders of complexification with greater numbers of boundaries. Things like meditation, therefore, are, in sort of the Arabindian sense, a process of evolution, or going back to the source of where there was no boundary, so that all appears as object. Whatever complexity one has got to, you can go back or reintegrate all of those systems that went before. In so doing, hold them as objects so that you dissolve the boundaries, so that subject and object become a pancake from which there is sort of split or duality. But it's a system of morality in the sense that the whole expression of it is one of which there is an embrace. In the Arthur Kesslorian sense, that there's a holonic structure that includes that which is before, so that if there's a pathology or an anomaly or an imbalance in the more foundational structures, it's carry that pathology into the higher order, as this is sort of holographically, in some sense, carried forth into the systems. This boundary is an expression of that boundary, but then it builds a new sheath within it, and that's a higher order of complexity. And in a sense, it's arbitrary to state exactly what boundaries there are. But it's like every time you witness the moment before a new boundary is formed, there's major, arguably, like, for example, when a being becomes self-reflective, it's not really one moment, but that sort of reality in a broader sense is a fairly big boundary. So is these sort of major boundary turning points within the fractal system. But they don't really happen necessarily at one moment in time. It's more of a blurry happening, arguably, but the heart is the place in which the needle is threaded. So, again, this is fairly abstract at this point, but it's, I think, getting closer to an expression of how I've kind of maintained the Wilbur quadrant theory here. You can kind of see this is the upper left, upper right, lower right. And within it you get patterns within patterns, and that's the fractal nature within it. And it has states of consciousness, arguably. You could say that this is the first state, or the causal state, the cause from which all things come. This is the subtle, maybe sort of the emotional ground. And then within that you get sort of the gross, and then there would be an even deeper one. So that's how I would put it. So there's a huge paradox that the more gross things get, that is to say, the more complex they are, the more gross they are, the more base in a certain sense they are, but at the same time, the further away they are from absolute subject.